might say, one of the really cruel things that both Meghan and Harry did to our late and brilliant monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, was this. When, if you remember way back in the Oprah Winfrey interview, they discussed at length the terrible situation regarding how people inside the firm, you remember that, it was inside the firm, had discussed, of course, the colour of the forthcoming baby that was to be known as Prince Archie. And this particularly really upset Her Majesty the Queen, because whichever way you look at it, this is a woman who's lived through 70 years of her monarchy, and her reign, and really didn't see people in other than she got on with them or she didn't, There wasn't that sort of side to her. Prince Philip, on the other hand, the Duke of Edinburgh, was very salty with his language and did say certain things that maybe were rather inappropriate. But what was interesting about the dynamic was the fact that the Queen literally would chastise him and sort of say, don't be ridiculous, this is the way it is, you understand how this works. But this particular moment, as I say, in that conversation where Meghan really laboured the point, and that really lifted the mass onslaught of terrible media regarding, of course, the royal family and the racism storm, was never really addressed. Of course, Meghan and Harry for years have let this particular story roll on, not just via their particular chat. Of course, Prince Harry brought it up again in various interviews, and then on top of all of that, they allowed that particular story to go on into books that they claimed, if you remember, she had no idea about, but very quickly she had an idea, and then she was exposed once again as a liar. A little bit like, as I've mentioned many times, and I found that really ridiculous that somebody was allowed to lie to such an extent that they'd had a secret wedding because she didn't like this orchestrated reality of what was a very royal wedding, a very successful royal wedding, and more importantly, one that brought in a lot of business for Great Britain. When you think about Meghan herself, she seems ungrateful at every single turn. But as we look today at the relationship between Meghan, the Queen, and her own mother, Doria Ragland, a sort of theme keeps emerging. As ever, let me explain. Morning, good to see you today. Thank you so much as ever for your time. It is good to take a look back at these longer form sort of stories because you realise exactly how these things do work out. People say to you, Neil, how does that work and how do you know that? Well, of course, in the fullness of time, as the late monarch famously said, you learn so many stories, and you learn by talking to people who were there at the time, who have now possibly retired, not too fussed about opening up, and more importantly, have the real inside track onto what went on. You see, very early on in the relationship with the Queen and Meghan Markle, there was this sort of story going around about how, particularly from Harry, how, the moment that Meghan arrived to meet the Queen, the corgis gave her signature of approval because she got on with them so well. Well, that's a little bit debatable too, because as we all know, we've seen with our brilliant Queen, she kind of controlled her own corgis. She liked things a certain way. She certainly didn't like you to pat them, and she would say to you, they don't like that. What she meant was, I don't like that. So you didn't. You weren't allowed to sort of fluff around with them. So that particular story, again, was, shall we say, advantageous to Meghan. It's a little bit like the story with Meghan, William and Catherine and Harry, where apparently they were so enamoured that Prince Harry was dating someone from a programme that they absolutely adored, never missed it, called Suits. I have it on excellent authority that both Catherine and William didn't really watch this programme, as didn't many millions of people over here in the United Kingdom. It wasn't the sort of thing that we looked at. We didn't know about it. It was a good hook story for the royal wedding, but truly nobody knew anything about it. But as this particular relationship grew and grew, what was fascinating was exactly how the late monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, really did try to reach out to Meghan Markle at the very start of their long and some might say fractious sort of relationship to try and make things a smooth path. This is because Prince Harry had painted Meghan as coming from a fractured background, something of a broken family, all of that sort of stuff, which led him to go on radio to say that Meghan has finally found the family that she's been searching for all of these years. A terrible slap down to, of course, her father Thomas Markle and, of course, her half-sister and brother. Seemingly they had no idea that Meghan had such a terrible time growing up, and that's now, as we all know, an ongoing battle in the court case. But when, apparently, the Queen and Meghan finally met, it wasn't all plain sailing. You see, Meghan had very much her own ideas. And while the Queen very nicely listened and nodded and yes, she knew, of course, that this was going to be very hard to put it back to Meghan about what was expected, what was tradition and royal protocol. Meghan wanted many outlandish things at that wedding, and she'd thought, no doubt, that the great British public were going to pay for them. There were many things, as we later found out, that Meghan apparently didn't like, including the musty smell of St. George's Chapel, and wanted to know why that couldn't be rectified. Time and time again, apparently Her Majesty the Queen had to really keep fighting back to say, well, could somebody have a word with Meghan? But of course, what was happening, as we now know behind the scenes, staff were becoming absolutely despondent, distraught, threatening to quit, all of that sort of stuff. Why didn't they? Well, actually, the reason why the staff didn't quit at that point was out of utter respect for our late monarch. They realised, as we've seen over the period of time, that clearly the Queen didn't know what to do herself because, as she pointed out, Prince Harry was just a little bit too in love. And she could see that he was headstrong, and the way to deal with him would be to make sure that he could see sense, but that was not meant to be. Now, the bigger picture was this. When she very first met Doria Ragland, and apparently they had tea, apparently, yes, the Queen liked Doria Ragland, and I use the liked, but she said she couldn't get really to the core of the person. This is because it was very much yes, no, yes, smiley, that sort of stuff. Now, you might say, of course, that this is Doria sitting opposite the most famous woman in the world and incredibly nervous, not really wanting to speak. But the Queen, being very savvy, according to my very well-placed source, realised that Doria wasn't willing to speak, didn't really want to talk about her background. And at this particular point, when they met, you've got to remember that it had just been announced, sadly, that, of course, Thomas Markle had suffered a terrible heart attack and was now unable to walk his daughter down the aisle. The Queen sympathised apparently about this and said it's a terrible thing because obviously it's a big moment in any father's life, isn't it? Apparently at this point, it was, well, shall we say, decided that maybe Doria would walk down her daughter. Do you remember? And what happened there was that apparently Doria thought that was going to be happening because that was the conversation that she had with Her Majesty the Queen. And then, of course, what happened behind the scenes was that Meghan thought, no, there's bigger fish to fry here. How about the Prince of Wales escorting me halfway down the aisle? And that was now going to be the sort of, the plot. Again, gets more interesting at this point because this was news to the Queen. And once again, the Prince of Wales had to point out he felt it was the only thing he could do at least to offer some kind of support to the family. You understand how this works. Now, moving forward very quickly, it was very, very obvious to the Queen that Doria was not going to give in and become, shall we say, super chummy. She decided, of course, to keep something of a distance, but it was portrayed to the Queen by Prince Harry, allegedly, that she was simply nervous and very much in the presence of somebody like Her Majesty. But apparently the Queen didn't really buy that, She was very keen to get the background of Meghan's family, exactly how they got to that point in their lives, exactly who was members of the family, all of that sort of stuff. Because if you remember at that time, it had come out in the media that no family members were going to be invited to the royal wedding. And as I mentioned this to you before, Her Majesty the Queen found this incredible that this was going to be the situation. How could you possibly have no family members other than your mother? Apparently this was brought up at that meeting to Doria, who very quickly clammed up and said, I'm leaving all of that to Harry and Meghan. It's nothing to do with me. So again, the Queen thought this was odd because she said, well, do you have a sister you'd like to maybe bring along and sit alongside you? I'd hate to think if you're sitting there all alone, there's going to be all of us, nobody with you. No. Now, when you look at the picture of, say, the Archie christening, you can see the Queen beaming, but you can see one thing also, that there's no real bond between Doria and Her Majesty the Queen, or indeed the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke was very savvy, and as we all know, pointed out the fact that you go on dates with actresses, you don't marry them, and he'd already given some very stern advice to Prince Harry moving forward. But this was the real telling point, because as things started to fall apart with all the family fracturing, According to that very well-placed source, the Queen did wonder why on earth Doria never really reached out back, say, to the Prince of Wales, who was very, very open about family units, that sort of stuff, wanting to make sure that people got on. And when they had meetings, apparently the now king did pass this on to the Queen and said he tried his very best to get conversations going, but it wasn't happening. Doria literally stopped taking calls. There was nothing there. Now, he felt, of course, having not met Thomas Markle, because he didn't come over, but they had offered lots of assistance through Harry to assist with all the tabloid onslaught, you know, the sort of thing. But no, apparently that was being dealt with, and no, there was no need for that. What really set the Queen's antennae up and running was simply this, that if you recall, William and Catherine invited both Harry and Meghan to Amner Hall, and this was like a weekend to stay together. But at the 11th hour, Meghan took ill and didn't want to pass on germs, the usual stuff. Obviously didn't want to be pinned down to any lengthy conversation, and realised that Catherine, as we saw on that now infamous, famous Windsor walkabout, had a rod of steel behind that sweet smile. She knew exactly what she needed to find out and maybe perhaps send back to Her Majesty the Queen. Either way, Meghan was too savvy for that, pulled out at the last minute. Now, apparently, she'd heard that Meghan was struggling with royal life, and this was because she didn't like the hustle and bustle of living in Kensington Palace, a palace slap bang in the centre of course, busy London. But she felt that Meghan would have enjoyed this simply because, well, there you were. You know, you'd enjoyed a big city like New York, you'd made programmes in Toronto with Suits, this would be the world for you. She didn't like it. So in order to be kinder, she suggested, first and foremost, of course, that one of her ladies-in-waiting could assist. Meghan didn't want that person. We know about this particular butler. She didn't want that one either. So the person who, of course, the Queen felt really understood the PR world, having been in it in real life, if you like, was none other than this great lady, Sophie Wessex. Now, what happened with Sophie Wessex was, and it's quite simple when you think, she just got a flat no. No, no, no. Meghan didn't need anybody but Harry. So you can understand exactly why when the Queen saw the Oprah Winfrey interview and there they were laying bare saying nobody had offered any assistance, the Queen obviously became very teary-eyed, knowing that she tried her very best and had members of the family had also reached out as well. She couldn't understand why Meghan had decided to rewrite history. It just simply didn't make sense. But as we careered forward, even towards the end of the Queen's life, the Queen was very adamant that she could make amends with both Harry and Meghan, despite what they said on Oprah Winfrey. And her sort of last roll of the dice really was the summer break in Balmoral. She suggested that, well, maybe, Meghan and Harry and the children would like to come for the summer. And this at first was, yes, that's very kind, why not, that sort of stuff. Again, at the 11th hour, they decided against it. This was because it was all to do with the fact that the way they treated Meghan, and as we now know, they were secretly working on the docuseries for Netflix. And this had been tipped off inside to royal households, and naturally, as we saw on that particular docuseries, they'd already filmed in royal property. So the Queen literally spent her very final summer without the people that she wanted to try and make amends with, not for the want of trying. But the biggest mystery ever, apparently according to this source that worked alongside the Queen, was exactly how come Doria, as a mother, as somebody who herself had obviously been through very difficult times, never reached out to anybody in the family to say, could you help my daughter? They found that particularly perplexing. And as that source also pointed out to me, while Doria may play the sweet, humble person, behind that facade there is a rod of steel. And more importantly, as they also pointed out, Meghan must have got it from somewhere. Sadly though, for the Queen, she was never able to realise what she wanted to put back together. And sadly, she also went to her master, hearing and knowing that apparently her family were racist, and more importantly, nobody wanted to spend their final summer together. Neil Sean in the very heart of Yorkshire.